How close do you feel to God at any given time? Just a thought. How close do you feel to God at any time? Do you feel close to God? What does it mean to be close to God? Have you ever felt a deep connection with God? What was it like when that happened? And maybe what were the circumstances? Just thoughts for you, questions to stimulate your thinking a little bit. What was going on in your body when you felt a close connection with God? What was going on in your mind when you felt a close connection with God? Do you sometimes feel disconnected from God? You know, these are all rhetorical questions. I think we can answer probably yes to all of them, more or less. I mean, except for the super spiritual ones of you, but most of us, right? We have had these mountaintops and valley experiences, right? What is it like to feel disconnected from God? Do we even notice at times that we're disconnected from God? What gets in the way? And my final question for the moment is, do you ever yearn for a deeper connection with God? Back in 1938, a man named Alfred E. Brumley wrote a song which some of you may know. It's called Turn Your Radio On. Anybody know this song? All right, just a handful of us. Turn your radio on. I will do you a favor and not sing it for you. Okay? But perhaps you have heard it. If you go to your streaming service or whatever, obviously we're not going to go to the radio, but we're going to go to the streaming service or whatever. You may hear the great version that was recorded by Ray Stevens, or if you prefer the Statler Brothers, or if you like the more of the Randy Travis kind of person, or maybe the Gaither. There's hundreds of versions of the song out there. But if you're thinking, I've never heard this song and I don't know who Alfred E. Brumley is, let me just go ahead and tell you that he also wrote a song called I'll Fly Away. And I assume that most of us know that one, right? I found a documentary, in fact, on Amazon Prime that was recently made where some people discovered some unfinished songs by Alfred Brumley. Apparently the man wrote something like 800 songs. How about that? But I'll Fly Away was one of them, and a personal favorite of mine is Turn Your Radio On. Maybe in a year like 2024, so we're looking at, almost 100 years later, the idea of turning on our radios is a little quaint, right? But the song itself has a very deep message, so I'd like to share with you a couple of stanzas, if I may. Come and listen to a radio station where the mighty host of heaven sing. Turn your radio on, turn your radio on. If you want to hear the songs of Zion coming from the land of endless spring, get in touch with God, turn your radio on. And then, of course, the chorus. Turn your radio on and listen to the music in the air. Turn your radio on and heaven's glories share. Turn the lights down low and listen to the Master's radio. Get in touch with God. Turn your radio on. And then the next stanza, my favorite. Don't you know that everybody is a radio receiver? All you got to do is listen for the call. Turn your radio on. Turn your radio on. If you listen in, you'll be a believer, leaning on the truth that will never fall. Get in touch with God. Turn your radio on. Of course, it goes on. And different groups have different different verses and so forth. Now, I ask myself, what was Alfred E. Brumley thinking about when he wrote this song? What exactly inspired it? Was he just making sort of capitalizing on the popularity of the radio in 1938? hey, I think I'll use that as an idea for a gospel song. Or maybe the use of the radio as a metaphor for our need to tune into God is kind of a clever idea, perhaps. Perhaps he was thinking about the fact that music is being broadcast all around us, but we cannot hear it unless we do what? We got to turn on the radio. You don't know it, but actually my voice is being transmitted through this room through an invisible signal. It's being received over there, and it's going back up here and out of these speakers, and it's going out through the internet and everywhere else, and who knows how many people are suffering through this as we speak. But you see, it's there, but you got to turn it on. You've got to access it, right? We cannot hear it unless we turn on our radio receivers. It's there if we want it, but we have to be receptive in order to hear it, right? Otherwise, it just goes over our heads. Now, if you can remember back to the days before digital radio or satellite radio or internet radio or whatever, you can remember back to those days. Like when I was a little boy, I had a little transistor radio. You put batteries in it, maybe a 9-volt, and you walked around and you had that antenna, right? You remember those days, some of you? Okay. Signal strength was important, right? It was very important. The quality of the receiver was important. If you had a cheap radio, it wasn't going to get very good sound, right? And your position in relation to the broadcast antenna was also important. And we're in good shape if you like WSB, because as you know, that antenna, transmission antenna, is just right over there in North Lake Festival, and you can see it from a long distance. I think all of these factors enhance Brumley's metaphor. Similarly, hearing the voice of God has something to do with tuning in, doesn't it? We have to be receptive to it. But there are factors that make listening to the voice of God difficult. Apparently, I'm having a difficult time reading my own writing here. Static interference in the form of inner and outer distractions of all kinds have a way of blocking us or blocking that signal. So in this series of messages for this month, I want to share with you what I think is a very simple principle. When the voice of God calls, we want to be able to hear it. We want to be able to receive it, right? So we also must be able to recognize what are the sources of interference, the sort of static that we deal with that kind of gets between us and that signal. And we want to talk about ways that we can unblock that static so that we can get a clearer signal from God. I don't know if I'm getting a little too far into the metaphor or not, but hopefully you understand what I mean by all that. I, for one, am a person who very often find it difficult to listen for the voice of God. Okay, I'm sure that doesn't surprise you, but sometimes people think, well, you're a pastor, you're supposed to be right there at God's right hand, or some people have that expectation. But you can get so deeply involved in the work of the ministry that you can't hear the voice of God. Like everyone else, like many of you, and perhaps like all of you, my day is filled with activity. Some of it is planned activity, and some of it is unplanned activity. And those unplanned activities, they can pop up and they can mess everything up, can't they? Yeah. Finding time to connect with God is one thing, but having the energy and the uninterrupted time to pursue this connection is something else. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Jesus said that. And I assume that if I experience this problem, I'm sure that many of you do as well. So these messages were born out of even my own need to be reconnected to God. And in fact, to me, this is one of the benefits of taking a sabbatical for a month. Getting some time away from the daily routine gave me an opportunity to sort of work on myself. And I know that sounds selfish in itself, unless the purpose of working on myself is for the purpose of unblocking that signal. Because when we feel disconnected within ourselves, we can't very well connect with other people. And if we can't very well connect with other people, we can't very well connect with God either. So we have to work on these things. Our goal in this first message then is simply to recognize what our role is in listening for the voice of God. This includes understanding the importance of allowing our spirit to tune in to God so that we can discern the message that God has for us. You know, sometimes we call this a sense of calling. And it's an interesting choice of words, calling, because I'm sure that all of us have a sense of calling, but those of us who are in the ordained ministry, we kind of have to prove that we have a sense of calling. We have to go through a lot of, things to prove that we are called by God to be in the ministry. And listening for that call, like Samuel or like Elijah, as we'll talk about in a minute, is important, but sometimes it is complicated by the issues of life, of course. I just mentioned Samuel and Elijah, but basically all of the Old Testament prophets were people who listened for the voice of God. And a lot of times, when the prophets heard the voice of God, you know what their next step was? They had to go to the people and say, "Thus saith the Lord." Yeah. So we will look at these two Old Testament prophets, Samuel, whom Gail has already shared with us about, and of course Elijah, and their experiences of hearing God. As Gail was reading the story about Samuel, he was a young boy in the tabernacle. I recommend reading 1 Samuel. It's a great read. It's filled with drama. You got to get past chapter 2, which chapter 2 is fine, but it's the song of Hannah. His mother shows a lot of poetry and stuff. So just kind of get past it. But you got David and Goliath, you got Saul, you got Jonathan. It's filled with a lot of great stuff. And at the beginning of 1 Samuel, there's no temple, right? It's the tabernacle, it's the tent. And it is being run by an older priest named Eli. And of course, he passes this on to his sons. And Eli's sons are not good, like a lot of preachers' kids, not mine, of course, but like a lot of good preachers' kids, they tend to be kind of wayward. And Eli's sons were wayward. And they were not doing a good job. They were actually exploiting the role. So Samuel was raised up and sent. And so we're going to see, if you read through Samuel, how the family of Eli is displaced and Samuel becomes the new priest and prophet who runs the tabernacle. God removed Eli's family from service, but not before Samuel had a chance to learn from Eli how to listen for the word of the Lord. So let's get into it just a little bit. Again, the passage tells us that Samuel was a boy. And you can kind of relate to this, right? He was a little boy in the tabernacle, but it also tells us two important things. First, in verse 1, we read that the word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. Now, I just want you to think about that language. The word of the Lord was rare in those days, and visions were not widespread. Think about what's going on in the culture in a day when the word of the Lord is rare and visions are not widespread. The second thing that we read in here that's kind of important, it says, Samuel did not yet know the word of the Lord, for the word of the Lord has not yet been revealed to him. You hear that repeated phrase, word of the Lord? That's important. So it keeps popping up. We might ask ourselves, was this word of the Lord an audible voice that he heard, or was it an inner voice that he heard? Well, my opinion is that this voice was not audible to anyone except to Samuel. Because after all, he ran to Eli, and Eli was not calling him, but he heard a voice. He knew that he heard his name. And that was repeated 3 times, of course. until Eli realized, you're having a visitation. God is speaking to you, so go back and lay down. And you know what he really told him? He said, turn your radio on, right? Go back and listen, and when God speaks to you again, say, speak, for your servant is listening. It was late at night. The lamps in the tabernacle were burning low, and everyone was in bed, right? And then, because it was quiet, because Samuel was relaxed, he was able to hear God speaking to him. Have you ever felt God come near? I don't expect you to answer. I don't expect you don't have to raise your hands or nod your heads. But I just want you to think about this. Have you ever felt God come near? Wouldn't it give you chills if you said, speak, for your servant is listening? Right? And then you were to experience something that said to you, God is speaking to me. And I don't mean to make this sound easy or common. I think it would be idolatrous if we were to act like, well, if I were to get quiet and lay down and say, God, speak to me, I'm listening. But God is not obligated to answer. I want to make that clear. I'm not saying that just because I get quiet and meditate and say, God, speak to me, doesn't mean that God has to speak to me. But what I'm talking about is being attuned to God. When God does speak to us, are we able to hear it? So I am not promoting, something that sounds like New Age, let's meditate and God's going to speak to us and so forth. In fact, what does the text say there in 1 Samuel? It says, the word of the Lord was rare in those days. God speaks when God chooses to speak. That means we need to be attentive and ready to hear when those times occur. This brings us to Elijah in a very famous passage. If you've never read 1 Kings, let me recommend it. I have never understood why Hollywood does not make a movie about Elijah. Because it would be up there with Moses and the 10 Commandments and the 10 plagues and all of that. You got to read Elijah if you haven't. It's just a really amazing 3 or 4 chapters in 1 Kings. And the very famous passage that you probably are familiar with is in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 11 through 13, when Elijah had reached a point or a state of mind where he could no longer hear the voice of God, and he was really at his wit's end. So God worked with him, and here is the passage. God says to him, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came the voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The events leading up to this passage are very, very dramatic. Elijah was a prophet who served many, many generations after Samuel. And once again, it was a very, very dark time in the history of Israel. In fact, Elijah found that the human odds were stacked against him. Many of the people had gone over into idolatry. They had become worshiping idols like Baal. You've all heard of Baal. And Ashtoreth and so forth, many local Canaanite gods. To incorporate it into their daily lives, I'm not getting what I want from God, so let me go out and expand my options, shall we say. Even so, Elijah was bold in his ministry. And in just a few chapters in 1 Kings, somewhere around 17 through about 19, we read about how he confronted King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. You thought Jezebel was just a name for a loose woman, right? There is a Jezebel in the Bible who is their namesake, right? He had to confront them because they were leading the people into idolatry. He pronounced a drought in God's name. He said, until I speak again, there will be no rain in Israel. And guess what? He had to run and hide because you make a lot of farmers mad. And when you're living off the land the way people did in those days, lack of rain is a problem. So he had to go and hide. And the Bible tells us that in the morning and in the evening, the ravens brought him food, bread, and meat. And he drank out of a wadi. You know, in the Middle East, a wadi is like a little stream, but it dries up, and it dried up. And then he had to leave Israel, and he went to a town in a place called Zarephath, which is actually in modern-day Lebanon, the ancient Phoenician Empire. And he went, and if you don't know the story, you got to read it. He came to this town where there was a widow. You know the story? And she was gathering sticks because she was going to make a fire because she had only one portion of grain left. And she had a son. And she was going to cook their last meal, not knowing where the rest of their sustenance was going to come from. Because remember, there's a drought. And Elijah, you know how the preachers are. They just are so imposing. He said, give me some of that. And she says, this is it. This is the last thing. I'm going to cook this for me and my son, and then we're going to starve to death. He says, well, give me some anyway. I'm paraphrasing. She does. And because she does, her grain and her oil never ran out during this time of drought. But then her son died. And all of a sudden it's kind of like, no good deed goes unpunished, right? And of course, Elijah was distressed about it. Elijah prayed to God, and her son was restored to her. So these are all some of the just really incredible and dramatic events that happened there. Moving on to chapter 18, it's time for a face-off. Elijah agrees to meet with 450 prophets of Baal on top of Mount Carmel. So this is 1 versus 450. Those are great odds. We love those, right? Now, if we could go back in time, we would take the Vegas odds on Elijah, of course. But they have 2 altars set up, one for the prophets of Baal and one for the one prophet of God. And they decide that whichever God, they're both going to cry out to their God, and whoever brings down fire to light the altar is going to be the true God. And so the prophets of Baal, all 450 of them, they go first, and they call upon Baal to rain down fire, and nothing happens, and they get more and more intense as the day goes by, and they dance and they wail, and they even go to the extreme of cutting themselves and bleeding themselves in order to get Baal's attention. Nothing happens, predictably. And then it's Elijah's turn, and he says, well, before I do this, I want you to douse the altar with fire. And they dug a pit around it, a trench around it. And he says, do it again. And the water rolled off the altar and even filled the trenches. And then he prayed to God. And if you know the story, you know that fire came down from heaven. It did not just consume the offering on the altar, but it consumed the altar. It consumed the water, and then it consumed the other altar. And Elijah in that moment then ordered the people to kill the 450 prophets of Baal, which they did. And you would think that this man would be riding high and feeling powerful. But he was spent. Jezebel speaks to him and says, I'm going to kill you. Again, paraphrasing. And Elijah takes off, and he runs, and he runs, and he runs. At this point, Elijah becomes a classic example of depression. And let's look at a passage in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 4 through 9. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. You ever been at that point in your life? Just kill me, Lord. I don't mean like in the humorous way. Oh, just kill me, God. No. He asked that he might die. It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors, which I think is a way of saying I'm better off dead. Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly, an angel touched him and said to him, get up and eat. He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you. He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. See, now we've come back around to that scripture we read a moment ago. These are the verses that come right before that, right? Before the dramatic scene of this wind that was splitting rocks and this earthquake that was shaking the mountain and this fire, before all of that. And now let's read the rest of verse 9 and then verse 10. Then the word of the Lord. You hear that? Didn't we talk about that earlier? The word of the Lord. Then the word of the Lord came to him saying, what are you doing here, Elijah? He answered, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Notice the elements of depression in these statements about Elijah. I underlined as many of them as I could in the passages. He wanted to die. And he says that everybody is trying to kill him, which may or may not be true, but at least in the text, we only know that Jezebel is trying to kill him. But when you're in this state, you're not thinking clearly, right? When you get to this point, you are not being realistic. You know, when a person is suicidal, you can't say, but God loves you, because they don't believe it. They, in that moment, are not capable of accepting that truth. Elijah was in the depths of depression, and he felt like everyone was out to kill him, and he was like, just take me, Lord, right? I know none of you have ever felt that way. Falling into deep sleep, but having to be made to eat. These are classic signs of depression, are they not? Right? Either people who get really clinically depressed, they either starve themselves or they overindulge, but they don't eat moderately, right? They tend to sleep all the time because they have no motivation and so forth. I think, and he had talked about how zealous he had been for the Lord, and we talked about all those dramatic events that happened. I think we can assume rather safely that he was burned out and low on resources. And to me, all of this translates into Elijah having a very distorted understanding of his situation, feeling alone and without meaning. Elijah here is the picture, the poster child, shall we say, of an existential crisis. I mean, if there ever was an existential crisis, this is it. And I dare to say that he felt disconnected from God, he felt disconnected from his people, and probably even internally disconnected with himself. But he was in God's therapy program. It is after these verses that God told Elijah to go out and stand in front of the cave, right? It is after this that God showed him all of the dramatic signs of tremendous wind and earthquakes and fire. But then God showed him the real power. What do the old translations say? A still, small voice. God was not in the dramatic displays of power, or we could say he was not only in them. Elijah was not able to sense the voice of God until he was able to quieten down all of the distractions and just listen. Let's bring Samuel back in very quickly. Though Samuel was a boy, he lived in very dark times. And in the book of Judges, which comes, I know that there's Ruth in there. We'll talk about that later. But Samuel really follows Judges. And in Judges, we hear this refrain repeated throughout. It goes like this. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All of the people did what was right in their own eyes. And that's the situation that existed when Samuel came in. And, of course, Eli was no help. His family, he was old, and his sons were corrupt. So Samuel is tasked with correcting that and with anointing kings in Israel. This is an indication of the times that we're talking about. Which means I want to go back and examine one more time a statement in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 3. It says, the lamp of God had not yet gone out. Now, we assumed that means that it was late at night or early morning when the oil in the lamps are getting low, right? That's the obvious meaning. But notice again the words in verse 1. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. You see, if Eli and his sons, who were supposed to be a light in Israel, that light had almost gone out. God needed someone to stand up and to be the light. And he called upon Samuel. You see, there is something more to this concept of tuning into God than just saying, I don't feel good today, God, I want you to speak to me. I need some personal edification. There's something more to hearing the voice of God than just overcoming a bad day. Tuning into God has something to do with the well-being of all the people, the well-being of the congregation, the well-being of the church, the well-being of the community, the well-being of the country, the well-being of the world. Because somebody has to receive that message and act upon it. If our only concern... Everybody wearing their steel-toed boots today? You know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about. If our only concern is personal edification, we are no better than the ancient people who brought idols into their worship of God. If being in the church means I come for an hour a week in order to feel better, we have become idolaters. Idolatry is a form of spirituality. And we're all about spirituality these days, aren't we? But idolatry is not informed by the voice of God. Idolatry is self-serving. Idolatry is about what's in it for me. It worships a God that panders to the individual's wants and desires, but it is not a connection to the transcendent God. It is more like somebody who stands in an echo chamber, hearing their voice repeated back to them and saying, this must be the voice of God. Tuning into God means that we do not make the playlist. Now, when I go on Apple Music, I can make a playlist. But I don't make a playlist with God. We can call in our request, if you don't mind me extending the metaphor a little bit, but that is not the point of listening to the voice of God. The signal, the message comes from God. We have a receiver, which is our spirit. What comes between us and God are the things that block, the distractions. Sometimes it's something physical, sometimes it's something mental, sometimes it's something spiritual. And we will discuss these kinds of distractions in the weeks to come. But for today, let us begin by asking ourselves this question: what, if anything, is coming between us and God? From here, we can begin the work of peeling away the layers and seeking the will of God by being willing servants who say, "Speak, for now I'm listening."